Welcome to America and Arizona Government for Elementary Teachers. This is Presentation 14, Arizona Local Government and Direct Democracy. While most of this course focuses on the federal government and state government, most of the actual services provided by the government are provided by local governments. Local governments, like counties and cities, have specific political dynamics that governments on a larger scale have. They're similar to that, but they do not have the publicity or notoriety that the higher levels do. Politicians who work at the local level are often citizen politicians who volunteer or work for little pay for the betterment of the communities they live in. Of course, there's also professional politicians and staffers whose career is managing the cities and county governments that provide the services essential to maintain the community. In this presentation, we'll look at some of the organizational structures of local government and some political dynamics of these governments that are specific to this level. This presentation will also look at the direct democracy mechanisms that exist in Arizona that are not necessarily unique to Arizona, but Arizona is a leader in. This presentation will examine AEPA Objective 16, Understand State and Local Government in the United States, and 19, Understand State Government and Government of American Indian Nations in Arizona. It will also look at some of the objectives under Concept 2, Structure of Government, contained within the Arizona Social Studies Standard, Strand 3, Civics and Government. You're encouraged to look at the document on the Social Studies Standard articulated by grade level and look at some of the objectives listed under Concept 2 to ensure that you understand and are able to competently teach those principles and objectives to your future students. Arizona is divided into 15 counties. Maricopa is the largest county in population, with over half of the state's residents residing in its borders. County government is an important part of Arizona's political system. It's a level of government that is obviously in between the state executive on the one side and the local cities on the other. As an in-between entity, it performs functions that are similar to both and yet unique. Counties in Arizona are responsible for operating the jails, prosecuting state crimes, administering social programs, operating the state superior courts and the justice of the peace courts, operating the county hospitals, maintaining elections and election records, maintaining records of deeds and mortgages. These are all functions that the state government might provide in other places, but in Arizona, these functions are left to the county governments. Now, there are also still parts of the state that are very sparsely populated and where residents have not been incorporated into a municipality. Now, in these areas, the county government provides direct services that a city government normally would, such as law enforcement, fire protection, utilities, enforcing zoning, regulating traffic. So, in many regards, the counties in Arizona perform both statewide functions and localized functions. Now, similar to the state executive branch, the counties operate under a system of plural executive power, meaning there are multiple entities that are independently elected, and so they can operate independent of each other and often at cross purposes. The counties are administered by a board of supervisors who are elected officials. The board appoints the county staff, such as clerks, public defenders, park administrators. The board also determines the budget for the county offices, including the offices that are run by officials who are elected separately. Now, this frequently causes tension between the board and those officials. Now, just like with the state government, the primary executive officials at the county level are independently elected, so that each has an independent power base, and they're not obligated to follow the direction of the board. The county officials who are elected include the county sheriff, the county attorney, the county assessor, the recorder, the treasurer, the superintendent of schools, and the clerk of the Superior Court. With this many officials standing for election but not controlling their own budget, it's no wonder that counties in Arizona are frequently filled with political intrigue. One of the more high-profile county positions is the county sheriff. The sheriff is responsible for the enforcement of state law, the holding of prisoners who are awaiting trial in the county and state courts, and providing local law enforcement in the unincorporated areas that the county has responsible for. Each county has its own sheriff, and most of them do their job with little fanfare. In the largest county, however, Sheriff Joe Arpaio has come to embody the position of county sheriff. With his populist message of immigration sweeps, the inmates wearing pink underwear and eating bologna sandwiches, and his self-promotion as America's toughest sheriff, Arpaio has built a power base that enables him to operate outside of the county system and even at odds with the direction of the Board of Supervisors. Now, in spite of those conflicts, or perhaps because of those controversial tactics, he has proven widely popular, easily winning re-election multiple times. The county attorney is responsible for trying cases in the Superior Court, the courts that reside in that county. That means the county attorney is the enforcer of state law that most defendants face in Arizona. The county attorney also represents the Board of Supervisors in whatever legal dispute they may become involved in. Recently, the potential conflict that is always present between the county elected officials erupted into reality in Maricopa. For many years, the county sheriff, Arpaio, tangled with the county attorney, Romley, over several issues, including immigration policy and allegations of abuse in the county jail. These two had a high-profile legal dispute involving multiple lawsuits and counter-lawsuits that ran for years and cost millions of dollars. Now, since both sides were county employees, the taxpayers picked up the tab for this dispute. Now, this dispute only ended with the end of Romley's term in office. The new county attorney, Andrew Thomas, became an ally of Arpaio. Arpaio then had a long-running dispute with the County Board of Supervisors involving allegations of fraud and corruption against the supervisors and allegations of wasteful spending and threats to reduce the sheriff's budget on the part of the supervisors. In this dispute, the county attorney took the sides of the sheriff and indicted almost the entire Board of Supervisors. The sheriff's office arrested the board members and seized the board's computers and interrogated county staff at their private residences. These cases were all thrown out of court for lack of evidence, at which point the sheriff and the county attorney began an investigation into the judges who made those rulings against them in an attempt to prove that they also were part of a grand conspiracy. As with the earlier dispute, These disputes between members of the executive branch at the county level cost millions of dollars, which was again paid by taxpayers because all sides in the dispute are working for the county. All of this infighting seems endemic to Maricopa, and it may be criticized by other counties in the state, but the very structure of the plural executive system makes all counties potential battlegrounds between the various elected members. This seems to be the way Arizonans like it, though, as voters recently rejected a ballot proposition which would have placed all of the county executives under the control of the county Board of Supervisors. This would make the executive members appointed officials rather than elected officials. That move was rejected by Arizona voters. So Arizona voters enjoy the political drama that takes place at their county levels. The next level of local government are the cities and towns, the municipalities. With little fanfare, these are the governments that provide most of the governmental goods and services that people enjoy and think of as the government. City officials provide police and fire protection. They maintain transportation infrastructure. They provide transit in the larger cities, and they enforce local laws and zoning, and in general provide other goods and services that affect the quality of life in a given municipality. The forms of city government vary. Some are run by mayors, and city councils pass the rules and ordinances, and the mayor functions as a chief executive, while others use a city manager model. The mayor model is the dominant model through much of the country, but there are only a few cities in Arizona that use this model. Most Arizona cities use the city manager model. In the city manager model system, the mayor is on the city council and gets a vote on the rules and ordinances like any other member of the city council does, but has no additional authority beyond what any other city council person would have. The mayor in these towns functions more as a head of state. He or she is the public face of the city and advocates for the city to attract business, attract tourists, give speeches at public events. But the day-to-day running of the city, the chief executive functions, is taken by a city manager. The city manager is not an elected official, but rather is an employee who is hired by the city council to run the city. This person attends the council meetings and gives presentations on the budget or any city issues that need to come to the council's attention. Unlike the mayor, most people are unaware of who the city manager is, but it is the city manager who does the day-to-day governing of the city. The city is run much more on a business model in this way, and it separates the day-to-day operations of the city from the politics that may occur on the city council. So most Arizona cities have opted for the city manager model as opposed to a mayoral model where the mayor functions as the chief executive. The Arizona Constitution grants cities a great degree of autonomy from the state legislature. However, the legislature does pass laws that affect the cities. If you remember, the hierarchy of laws that is set forth in the Arizona Constitution says that state statutes do indeed trump municipal ordinances and agency regulations. So when there's a conflict, it is the state legislature's will that wins. In addition to that, the legislature can access funds that the cities have set aside, as it did in 2010 to help balance the state budget. The legislature can also pass laws that function like an unfunded mandate, requiring cities to do things but not appropriating money to the cities to do them with. Also, cities can reach such a financial or legal difficulties that politicians in the state capital have lost confidence in the ability of the people of that city to govern themselves. So it is possible for the legislature to revoke a city's charter, though this rarely, if ever, occurs. The next form of governing body within the state are districts. Now, districts have the power to set taxes and policies specific to the domain for which they were created. Some examples would be the community college districts that operate in most of the counties in the state. There are health districts that are set up to administer hospitals, and school districts that run the local K through 12 school systems. There are stadium districts and library districts. All of these districts have taxing authority, so they can establish a tax base to pay for whatever policy they're in charge of, and they can also regulate how that money is spent and whatever entity the district is over, be it a hospital or a community college or a school. So these districts are created and governed by laws set forth by the legislature, and the districts are administered and run by boards who tend also to be elected officials. Now, like cities, districts can get in such financial trouble or political trouble that the legislature and state agencies feel the need to intervene and remove the self-governing authority of that district. An example of this would be in the 2000s, the state felt that the school districts in Colorado City were not being administered properly. This is part of the polygamy trials that were ongoing, but in this city of Colorado City, the local school board and school district was allocating the money to buy jets and other large ticket items that were used by a local church leader, and then not paying the salaries of the teachers who worked there. And so in the face of that sort of blatant misappropriation of funds, the state intervened and removed the officials that were in charge of that school district, and the state Department of Education directly administered that school district for a while to bring those expenses back into order and to reestablish proper governing principles in that district. So these district bodies throughout the state operate with a large degree of autonomy, and you can't underestimate the power that they have to raise taxes within their district. But at the same time, they are held accountable by the state executive branch and the legislature. The last form of local government to discuss is embodied by the 21 tribal governments that operate in the state. As part of the treaties that created these reservations, these communities have a large degree of autonomy from the state government. They are essentially sovereign nations within the state boundaries. These tribal governments have a complex relationship with the state government. Most state law does not apply on tribal territory. The tribal governments are, however, subject to all federal law, and their residents are U.S. citizens. But most of the regulations and functions that would be provided by a state or local entity throughout the rest of the state are provided by the tribe on these reservations. And the tribal council governs these areas as an independent and autonomous local government. Now that we've discussed the basic structures of the institutions of state government, one final thing we need to look at to understand Arizona's politics are the measures put in the Constitution by the framers to ensure that Arizonans enjoyed several options for direct democracy. Now let me take a minute here and explain the difference between direct and representative democracy. Direct democracy is where all of the people governed have a say in the policies that they're being governed by. We could bring to mind the New England town that doesn't have a mayor. They would meet once or twice a year, and the entire town would get together and discuss whether or not to hire a dog catcher and what salary they ought to pay that dog catcher, and maybe what color the uniform ought to be for that dog catcher. And the entire town discusses and debates that issue. And then they might talk about their school system, or they might talk about the speed limit, or whether to put speed bumps on a particular road. And the entire town has this conversation and then votes on these measures. Representative democracy is where people elect others who then make those kinds of decisions. The minutia of government is determined by an elected representative. So we can contrast the New England town with your typical Arizona town, where citizens vote and elect a mayor, they elect city council members, and then those city council members hold a meeting where they discuss whether or not to hire a dog catcher and what salary to pay the dog catcher, and perhaps even what color the dog catcher's uniform ought to be. The citizens aren't engaged in that conversation. They've entrusted, they've granted the authority to those elected officials to make those decisions for them. And that's what representative democracy is. Now, direct democracy usually only occurs in very small localities because of the logistics involved. I mean, you can imagine if the city of Phoenix decided to have a plebiscite on whether or not they should hire a dog catcher. Tens of thousands of people might show up for that meeting. It's unwieldy. And so representative democracy allows for an efficient government and a powerful government that nevertheless is grounded in the consent of the governed. Now, the founders of the Arizona Constitution, again, informed by their progressive notions, argued that your everyday citizen should have more of a say in their government than representative democracy normally allows for. Recall that the territorial governors were carpetbaggers appointed as friends of the president, not people who actually lived here. And the territorial legislature was often captured by the mining and corporate interests that were so powerful in the early state. And so they wanted to have a mechanism for everyday citizens to have a say in the policies that governed them. Now, these provisions, like the initiative, the recall, the referendum, were included in the Constitution. I should note here that states whose constitutions were written prior to the Progressive Era, meaning their constitutions were in place before the late 1800s, do not have these elements in them. Or if they have them, they're much more constrained than they are in Arizona. So as a Western state, and as one of the last states to actually write a constitution, our constitution has more direct democracy potential than most other states in the Union. As a result, Arizona has more initiatives than almost any other state. Anytime Arizonans go to a statewide ballot, is guaranteed to have a handful, if not a whole raft, of ballot propositions that they have to vote on. Many of these ballot propositions originate as citizen initiatives. The way the initiative process works is an interest group or a group of citizens decide there ought to be a law, and so they will write down the wording of the law that they want enacted. They then, rather than give that to a legislator to try to get it passed through the legislature, they would then instead go to the Secretary of State and get certified as an initiative. They then would get signature forms and go around and collect signatures from registered voters. It numbers in the thousands. It's quite a few signatures that need to be collected. If they gather enough signatures, they then can go back to the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State will verify that those signatures are indeed valid, and if so, the Secretary of State will certify that initiative as a ballot proposition to be included in the next general election. Now, you can't these days go to a library or a mall or a parade without being surrounded by petition gatherers, because several groups take advantage of this initiative process to bypass the legislature and have the Arizona voters directly pass legislation. Most of these ballots obtain their signatures through professional signature gatherers. The going rate is usually $1 to $2 per signature that they're able to get. This potentially causes problems, as the motive of the signature gatherer may not be the same as the Secretary of State. Their objective is to get as many signatures as possible so they can earn money. So that's one reason why the Secretary of State has to verify that those signatures are indeed valid signatures of people who are registered to vote in Arizona. Now, once the wording for the proposition has been approved, it is placed on the ballot, and the voters then vote. And if the voters vote in favor of the initiative, it immediately becomes law. It does not require any action by the legislature, nor does the governor sign it. It immediately becomes law. Now, one thing to realize about the propositions in Arizona is that we have placed handcuffs on the legislature. They are not allowed to revise these initiatives. Now, this stems from the 1994 case where a ballot proposition was put out there that would legalize marijuana. And most of the signatures gatherers didn't tell people that the proposition was legalizing marijuana. They told people it was a proposition to put violent offenders in jail for longer sentences. And that indeed was one of the provisions. And the way the proposition was going to pay for that was by decriminalizing marijuana and releasing all of those who are in prison on drug charges. And that would then open up lots of room in the prisons for violent offenders to serve longer sentences. So the signatures were gathered. the proposition was on the ballot, and it actually passed. Again, most people thought they were voting to increase sentences for violent offenders. After the proposition passed and the news reported that Arizona had legalized marijuana, the legislature immediately in the next session passed a law removing that statute from the books and overturned the proposition. The response to that was a new initiative that said that the legislature cannot change the wording or the intent of a proposition ballot unless it has a 3/4 majority in both houses. Realize that a 3/4 majority is almost impossible under the best of circumstances. And if you recall the way the Arizona legislature operates, party caucuses craft almost all of the legislation that passes through, which means that the parties don't work together at all in the Arizona legislature, and so it's impossible to achieve a supermajority as a result. This means that all subsequent initiatives are locked in, that when a voter-approved proposition passes, the legislature can't touch it. Now, that has complicated the efforts on the part of the legislature to balance the budget, because much of the budget has been carved out by voter initiatives mandating certain spending. The legislature cannot undo that spending without having the voters vote again to remove that. So the initiative process is an example of direct democracy where the citizens decide what the laws are going to be, and then in Arizona's case, the legislature can't touch those laws. Another form of direct democracy is the referendum. The referendum is where the legislature passes a law, but the law does not take effect. Instead, all the law does is put a measure on the ballot for the next general election. The voters then vote on that measure, and if the voters approve it, it immediately becomes law without the governor's signature. And if the voters don't approve it, well, obviously it fails. It's useful to ask the question, why would the legislature do this? Because it takes a majority vote to create a referendum. So why doesn't the legislature simply pass the law with the majority vote that they are enjoying? There's a couple reasons why the legislature passes referenda. One is to pass off tough decisions to the voters. When there's a decision that would require a legislator to cast a vote that would expose them to a tough re-election campaign. For example, creating a tax increase. Voting in favor of a tax is political death. It's a good way to lose your job as a legislator. So instead, they could pass that decision off on to voters. Another example might be rezoning a territory, or passing a law that prohibits hunting on a particular area, or, as is going to be the case in the upcoming election, pass a law that makes it so that unions have to have an open election when a workplace is unionizing. Now, the legislature could have just passed that law, but by making it a referenda, it becomes a citizen issue, and the legislators are able to say, well, look, I would have never voted for a tax increase. All I'm doing is giving the citizens an opportunity to decide yes or no. And so it's a way to pass off the tough decisions. Another reason for why a legislature would do a referendum is to take advantage of that 94 initiative that says that the legislature can't alter a measure that has been passed by a ballot proposition unless it has a supermajority, which, as I've said, is a near impossibility in the Arizona legislature, the way the politics run in our legislature. So, if a legislature were to pass a law by a simple majority, they could indeed pass the law, but then a future legislature could pass a new law which would undo the law that you've passed. However, if instead of passing a law, you use your majority to put a proposition on the ballot, and the public then votes in favor of that proposition, that law is now locked in. It's set in stone. A future legislature can't touch it, can't alter it, unless they can muster that 3/4 majority, which again is nearly impossible. So there is a strategic reason for why the legislature would pass off a decision to the voters in a ballot proposition. Finally, anything that involves an increase in taxes, the state constitution mandates that those tax increases have to go to the voters. So the legislature can pass it, but it doesn't take effect until the voters have voted on it. So they're constitutionally required to use the referendum if it's a tax increase. So these are ways that the legislature can either abdicate or utilize the direct democracy provisions of the ballot propositions. Now, between the citizen initiatives and the legislature's referenda, Arizona ballots are often quite crowded. Now, you can understand something about the proposition, the origin of a proposition, by the numbers that are attached to it. If the proposition has a 100 in front of it, then that means that that proposition involves a constitutional amendment, whether it comes from the initiative or a referenda, that if that proposition is passed, the Arizona Constitution will be altered in whatever manner in which the proposition recommends it is. Now, if there is a 200 in front of the number, then that means that it has reached that ballot through the referendum process. So the state legislature has written that proposition, and they're asking the voters to vote for that. If there is a 300, then that means that that proposition originated as a citizen initiative. So they signed the petitions and achieved enough signatures to be able to put it on the ballot. Now, if there's a 400 by the number, that means it's a local issue of some kind, typically bond elections, or perhaps a city or county will have an issue that needs to be addressed by the general voting public. So those numbers can help you understand where these propositions are coming from. It's important to read through the voter information packets on these propositions to find out what they will do, because sometimes a no vote means yes and a yes vote means no, the way they're worded. So it's important to carefully review those propositions. The final form of direct democracy is the recall. Now, remember that President Taft vetoed the Constitution over the issue of judicial recall. Now, once the Constitution was established, the Arizona voters replaced that provision so that power to recall judges still exists. It's only been used a couple of times, though, so Taft need not have worried about it. But I want to differentiate between impeachment versus recall. Impeachment is when an elected body, a representative body, moves to remove a person from office. So if the legislature decides to remove someone from office, that's an impeachment. A recall is when the citizens act to remove that person from office, not the legislature. So a recall is initiated by a petition similar to a ballot proposition, and registered voters need to sign that petition saying that this public person needs to be eliminated. Once those signatures are verified, it then goes on the ballot, and the voters can vote to recall that official. Recalls are rare, but they do occasionally occur. But it is another example that the founders of the Constitution wanted that tool to be available to the voting public in case their government ceased to work in their interests and was only working in corporate or the personal interests of the politicians. Arizona's Constitution sets the state's political institutions up in a way that is similar in institutional form to those around the nation. Yet our institutions are unique as a result of Arizona's history. The impact of the progressive era's philosophies on the founders means that we have an executive branch that is very weak compared to other states and counties, with power divided amongst many elected officials. We have a highly partisan legislature, and we have, as citizens, many opportunities to engage in direct democracy and decide the direction the state will take. As a citizen of Arizona, it is important to understand these processes and constantly pay attention to what is going on at the state and local level. Power in Arizona is so spread out, and the opportunities for citizen action are so prevalent that change is constant on the Arizona political scene. This means that for your policy preferences to take place, you need to be ever vigilant and watch the political processes around you. This presentation is courtesy of Brian Dille. I'm the speaker, and I'm a professor of political science at Mesa Community College, a college of the Maricopa Community College District in Mesa, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.